It is January 20th, 2025, Parshat Va'era, second Parsha in the book of Shmot. I'm going to start by saying this Parsha and the part of next week's Parsha dealing with the plagues is complicated. I always find it rather difficult to talk about these Parshas. Um, because there's just a lot coming at us from all sorts of different directions. Um, and as inclined as we are, we also have in our minds, a lot of familiarity with this because of Passover. So it's as usual one of these sections we think we know it, and because we are familiar with it from a religion, from ritual, from regular retelling. But even when we retell it in Passover, we're doing it with ritual. We're doing it, by spilling the wine, and we're reciting it. We're not reciting the plagues in their literary context. We're not reciting their plagues. We're not reading the story of the plagues. We've condensed them into this litany, into a ritual, and that already gives us a different kind of experience of them. Um, I'm not sure if this is the question, which is how is the text, how does the text want us to encounter the plagues, as opposed to how do we commemorate the plagues? Um, and that question of how do we encounter a text is a much more sophisticated question than how do we remember an event and make it into a ritual and a symbol, right? At this very moment, I haven't been watching, but you have a highly choreographed ritual taking place in the Capitol in Washington, right? Where the president is, taking the oath. This is a very ritualized ceremony. There's a person administering, there's a person taking it, there's a text, etc. And then, the question of how it's commemorated and how it's recalled. And so, many of you may have seen, kinds of news reports, anthologies of or visual anthologies, typically of other inauguration ceremonies going back to, I guess the modern era where you would have had, presidents being filmed. I saw, a report starting with, I guess it was Eisenhower. I mean, going back already to the 50s. And so you had, different clips of different presidents going, and that becomes a kind of ritual in the American landscape. We don't, you know, I mean, I know that this is going to annoy a lot of people if I say this, but nobody is sitting down to a celebratory meal today, right? And except the people, involved in the ceremony. That the tradition is that they go and have a lunch. There's a congressional lunch with the president. But you know, I suppose if we were more tuned or celebratory, we would make our own feast, and of course that's where I'll stop, and people react to that, of course, in their own ways. Not nobody wants to do that, um, and that just says that we are linked in a different kind of ritual sphere to this event as opposed to our family. We watch it on television. Um, maybe some people have watched parties, but that that would be the limit of this. Okay, so our encounter with the text is mostly through ritual. And the text itself of the plagues is complicated. I'll give you an example of this, or I'll show how, one commentary tries to look at this. Here we go. Okay, so my question is how to read the plagues, and I've taken this chart here. It's Hebrew, and I'll explain it to you. This is from this book. This is a popular Israeli series. Um, it is, what does it say? It's Olam Tanakh. Olam Tanakh. This is published by a popular publisher in Israel, and it's got, for the book of Shemot, it's got all sorts of nice things, pictures, maps, and everything, and charts. The kind of thing that a person like me who prepares for a class like this or Parsha sheets, I love to copy these things and paste them into my Parsha sheets. They're really interesting, pictures of gods, goddesses. Uh, this is a nursing god, Egypt, and other kinds of things. And you can see, okay, so the Bible, the Torah, obviously, captures all of our imaginations in terms of asking one basic question, which is what kind of world does it come out of? But here in this book, they charted out the plagues. Now I'm going to try and present it to you. It's in Hebrew, okay? But here in this column here, you have Shem Hamaka, the name of the plague. So you may recognize Dam, Tzvardei, Kinim, Arov, Dever, Shchin, Barad, Arbe, Choshek, Makat, Bechorot. The three, they're grouped in three groupings: Dam, Tzvardei, Kinim, which is blood, frogs, lice; Arov, Dever, Shchin, wild animals, pestilence, boils; Barad, Arbe, Choshech, hail, locust, darkness; and then the slaying of the firstborn. Okay, so what and of course in at the Seder, you're all familiar. I'm just going to make this pretty big. Ditzach Adash Be'achav. Okay, it's Rabbi Yehuda haya noten bahem simanim Ditzach Adash Be'achav, and what we don't realize there, it's what's interesting is um, he creates a mnemonic for this so that we can remember the plagues, but they're grouped in very much this group. Now, what makes this grouping, this set of grouping, interesting, is that it corresponds to different kinds of to different items in the plagues. So here we go. The first three, notice that it says Aharon, Aharon, Aharon. So Aaron is the agent of the plague, okay? Mevi hamaka, the person who brings the plague, Aaron, Aaron, Aaron. And then it's Adonai, Adonai, and Moshe. So God, God, and Moses, Bezrat Aaron. Moses partnered with Aaron. The third grouping is Moshe, Moshe, Moshe. Moses is the agent of them. And then the last one is God. Okay. Now, here's the problem. Okay. You know, we we can configure the plagues in probably more than one way, but this is a convenient way to configure them. I'm not sure exactly what to make of this, other than to say, well, isn't it interesting that you have three Aaron plagues, three Moses plagues, etc. What to me is a little more interesting is is this the last column. I'm going to try and make it big, and I didn't translate it, but this is Hachbadat Lev Paro, which is the hardening or strengthening of Pharaoh's heart, which is really, I'm not, I wasn't planning to get into this question, but it really is the big philosophical theological question of the whole story, which is that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and that seems to mean that God is, forcing, Pharaoh to accept these things, and Pharaoh has no direct free will. So I'm going to set the question aside, the moral, ethical question, and focus more on the literary aspects of it, and look, this 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 is called chiasma, where or more importantly, I guess, symmetry. I'm just trying to shrink it, and it's hard to shrink. Here we go. So you see, vayechazak, vayechazek, hachbed, hachbed, vayechazak, vayechazak, vayechbed, yachbed. So you have the first plague in with regard to the first plague, it's using the word chazak, and the last plague is chazak, or so it's actually the first eight plagues are have this kind of this structure: 1, 8, 2, 7, 3, 5. I'm sorry, 4, 1, 8, 2, 7, 3, 6, 4, 5. 4, 5 are symmetrical, 3, 7 symmetrical, 2, I'm sorry, 3, 6 symmetrical, 2, 7 symmetrical, and 1, 8 symmetrical. All right. I would say that's neat. Okay, that's very interesting, and that tells us something. It tells us something very basic. It says we're in a story, and we're in a story, and as usual, when we are being told a story, we're going to enter a world, and we're entering the world that is a world that is trying to convey something. And I would say it as follows. We often get hung up on the questions of, did this really happen? And how did this happen? And what's a miracle? And what's nature? And all that. And is nature suspended, etc. And I almost want to say, I read this with one part of my brain, which is the imaginative part, and another part, which is the theological part. And I so want to have the synthesis of both parts. I want to enter into a world in which what the story is speaking to me is it's relating a certain set of truths to me in terms of you know what 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 I how I'm going to view the world, basically. And the conclusion is a simple conclusion or basic conclusion, which is there's God in the world, and there are people in the world, and that God is at this moment in a part of human history, which you could say in another way that human beings are perceiving God in history. And that's, I think, a natural tendency. I'll just, why don't we just, put in, the events of the last 2 days as examples. If you were watching the release of the hostages, which I don't think anybody could watch with a dry eye anywhere. It was just so emotional to watch this. Um, and people are saying, "Wow, Zenes, it's a miracle, and making brachot, and you know, um, uh, these scenes are just so uniquely Israeli, but they're very very Jewish. How the anchor, the news anchor, a completely secular woman who you would never ever think would utter a bracha, but the anchor, the Israeli anchor news is saying, "Shechianu v'kimanu v'gyanu lazman hazeh." Wow, and you say, okay, so this is the human attempt to articulate the divine hand in history, and yet, of course, if you just separate yourself from the emotional part of the experience and you ask, well, they're being released from captivity, from these dungeons, from being held against their will. Is that God's will? Would you say then that it was God's, doing to that they got into captivity? So it raises a whole host of rather complicated and difficult theological problems.
Mm.
Notwithstanding that, what is being expressed is joy and gratitude, and that needs its outlet, and that needs something. And then, it's the human mind, and of course, with our religious story and our tradition, it it all has to go somewhere. Gratitude goes to God, and yes, we do see patterns, and yes, we do see the divine hand. It's harder and harder and harder to see the divine hand. The Torah records for it in a certain stage of history, and we're entering into that world, right, where it's all the divine hand and it's all about God. And so reading these because they're so complicated, every plague has its setup and pattern, etc. It begs from us really the question, how do we read this? So I bring this chart, just as an example of a complicated text that takes place over, several chapters. It's over two parshas. This week and next week this week our parsha takes us all the way from Dam, Tzvardea, Kinim, Arov, Dever, Shchin to Barad, the seven plagues. The Barad is the seventh plague. And next week we have Arbe, Choshech, and Makat Bechorot. Um, and I was so tempted, I'm so inclined to, the way that numbers are found in the Torah, the Barad plague, the seventh plague, there's something unique about that plague, but even to present the text and to show that that text itself is built in a certain symmetrical way is actually very, very complicated. It's a very complicated thing, which made me ask the question, you know, people listening to the story or reading the story, in antiquity, would they have picked up all of the nuances of it? Would they have heard it in this way, or to what extent these stories were told in order for them to appreciate that? And of course, that's hard. So I have here the bottom line, which is it's a complicated story, and it's not in the same vein as the stories of Genesis, which really make us ask, a certain set of questions about the characters and the themes. Nevertheless, despite it being complicated, um, we can ask some basic literary questions. So, like this: who are the characters? Where is it located? How are the events narrated? Who speaks? What are some of the basic terms? What's the intention of the text? What questions do they raise for us? Are our questions the same questions as readers of past generation? Or I was having, a friend of mine was asking me, trying to have a conversation prior to this, and I said I was busy preparing. I can't have the conversation, and so it was. The question was, I said, "Look, I'm preparing the class on the plagues, on the literary structure of the plague narratives in the book of Exodus." And she said, "Well, how has the text changed from last year?" And I said, "The text hasn't changed. I've changed, right?" And I think that's really the point. The point is that we try and approach these texts with a new set of eyes every time we see them, because they're classic texts, and that's what a classic text demands of us. A piece of art demands that of us. And a piece of literature demands that of certainly the Torah would demand that of us as well, right? I'm sure you've had your own experiences of, listening to certain kinds of music that you may like, and you may hear it in a different way. You may have different associations, etc., or your encounters with with literature, etc. I don't. My colleague Rabbi Chesler, who was on Parsha Talk, I envy him because he reads and rereads. I don't know where he has all the time to do this, but he'll reread all the things that he's read, before years ago, and I just don't have the time for that. But it's obvious that when if you read a classic piece of literature, in your 20s and then return to it in your 60s, you're obviously going to have a different experience with it. And in Judaism, we are meant to have different experiences with the text on a regular basis, on an annual basis. I think that alone is sufficient. It's a religious message. That alone is a religious message that validates that a person is not stagnant. I often explain to you and share with everyone, in shul, that I think I understand something, and I get very, very committed to my personal understandings of it until I discover something new, and it changes the way I think about it. Um, and that happens when you study, and that happens when you have conversations with people about things. So that's my orientation to the plagues. Um, and we're going to read the preamble to the plagues, which kind of, I think, condenses for us who and what is going on. All right. So here it goes. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. God said to Moses, "See, I make you as a god for Pharaoh. Re'e nataticha Elohim leFaro, v'Aaron achicha yireni v'yecha." And Aaron, your brother, will be your prophet. Ata tedaber, you are to speak. Et kol asher atzaveka, all that I command you. Aaron achicha, Aaron your brother, yedaber al Paro, he is to speak to Pharaoh. V'shilach et bnei Yisrael me'artzo, so that he may send free the children of Israel from his land. V'ani, but I, God, akshe et lev Paro, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. V'rebeti et ototai, make my signs, et moftai be'eretz Mitzrayim, many in the land of Egypt. V'lo yishma lechem Paro, Pharaoh will not hearken to you. V'natati et yadi b'Mitzrayim, I will set my hand against Egypt. V'hotzeti et tzivotai et ami b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Yisrael b'shvatim gdolim, and I will bring out my forces, my people, the children of Israel, from the land of Egypt with great acts of judgment. V'yadu Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai, and the Egyptians will know that I am God. B'ntoti et yadi al Mitzrayim v'hotzeti b'nei Yisrael metucham, when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring the children of Israel from their midst. Vayas Moshe v'Aaron kasher tziva Adonai otam ken asu. Moses and Aaron did it as God commanded them, thus they did. Moshe ben shmonim shana v'Aaron ben shalosh u'shmonim shana b'dabram al Paro. Moses was 80, and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. I included the last line here uh, because it's a great punchline. It's like, you know, they were 80 and 83, and they did it. Okay, and what's so interesting, I see your hands a second. What's so interesting is that, this is that we have in the space of what, 6 verses, 7 verses here, the whole story. Okay, this is at the beginning of chapter 7 of Exodus, and the truth is, you know, uh, we we um, we may not need the rest of the story after this. But this, I'm tempted to say that what I just read for you, chapter 7, verses 1 to 7, is like the overture, right? It's the overture to the plague story. I call it the preamble, but it's more like an overture because, like an overture, if attend a musical or an opera, the overture will give you kind of like the hints of all the themes that you're going to hear in what's upcoming. And so what you have in that overture are pretty much the basic themes. But I'm going to turn it over to Alana. Go ahead, Alana.
Shouldn't we have a problem with the verse that says that God will harden the heart of Paro so that God could show his greatness, and on the meantime, the Israelis, Bnei Israel, are still being slaves, and it's taking time. And it reminds me so much what's happening now with the hostages, that it's being prolonged to let them out so that the Israeli army can show what they can do and continue with the war.
I think it's such it's so interesting. And I mentioned, the text doesn't change, but we change, right? So it's a perfect example. Here we have this, we're going through this tremendously world historical and personally, emotionally anguishing moment, watching these scenes, and they change us. And we're trying to see with an event that is playing itself out in real time across the ocean, you know, we're trying to see these themes, and you're absolutely right. So what you're absolutely right is that you know where's the free will of people where when you take people and incarcerate them and make them hostage and capture and abduct them, steal them, and restrict their movement, and you are making them, it's not even slaves, it's worse than slaves. You're preventing them from being free, right? And so, in the negotiation for their release, the intransigence of the negotiation, right? And the way that there's no flexibility. The hard we that's what we would call the hardening of a position, right? And what I think causes us a great deal of anguish is that we come to negotiate like people, you know, you have a certain posture in a negotiation. You don't get everything, right? So and at what point do you just say, I'm not, I have to have everything? And that's, I think it applies obviously, to both sides, but obviously we see in the intransigence. Otherwise, we would have had a deal a long time ago. There's no flexibility, and there's no need to be flexibility because there's no limit to what they're willing to sacrifice in their people. One second on that. So my point is that even in a negotiation, a person can become hardened to another element, and that in fact is what happens in the story. In the story, there are moments later on where Pharaoh says, "Okay, I'll let you go," and then God hardens his heart, and he becomes intransigent, and he doesn't want to let them go. And our experience as reading this is, why are you doing that, God? Why are you setting this up? It's not fair in some ways to blame him if you're going to harden his heart and restrict him. And what's the best way to explain that? And of course that's a conversation that commentaries and philosophers on the Torah have had, including people like Maimonides, who say this is about, the punishment is the restriction of freedom, that by taking away Pharaoh's freedom to act according to his will, that is, a kind of ultimate punishment. He is a slave to his own instincts and his own narcissism and power. And the demonstration that is going on here is the ultimate story of God, who is sovereign of the whole universe, and a human being who thinks that he is. And that's the difference. Go ahead, Nanette. Yeah, you have to unmute.
I did. Okay, so I hate to bring this up, but being that Alana started, I mean, the ultimate hideous restriction, of course, was the Holocaust. I mean, you know, there was no, I don't think there was no negotiation. I mean, you know, America, France, the other had to just go in and, forcefully. And you got to wonder, where was God?
Well, so it's obvious that these things raise these huge theological questions, and you know uh, here, back in the story of Egypt, we have uh, a story about a power that is a state, you know, power, a a a a monarch who has power over everything. And the question that many human beings have to endure in many political systems other than the United States is how to live in a situation where they're not free. At least that in the United States, whatever anyone has to, I mean, I'm sure there are large debates about this, obviously, but the Constitution of the United States guarantees your freedom, and we don't acknowledge enough how privileged we are, how important that is, how lucky we are to have basic freedoms. Whereas in much of the world, I'm not sure majority of the world, but maybe a majority of the world, people don't have the freedom to speak, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to worship, and the freedoms that we are guaranteed here. And that's true in antiquity, back into this story. And so, yes, it's not an accident that we can kind of split the screen here and say, we're reading contemporary, the historical experiences of the Jewish people in light of the story. I think Jews in the Holocaust did that as well. They understood their suffering and their servitude very much in terms of the story of Egypt. I would argue that they thought, and rightly so, that their suffering was worse. That because Egypt, at least, while there were quote unquote genocidal decrees against the infants in Egypt, um, Pharaoh was more interested in the labor, and sustained the people. He Pharaoh needed the labor supply and um, did not want to kill them all. At least he enjoyed having the laborers, the slaves, because that made Pharaoh Pharaoh. But the Holocaust is about killing Jews. I mean, and expropriating all of their labor before you killed them. That is certainly one major difference. So it's not an accident. And of course, we have the same theological question of God in the story of the Exodus. At least we have the Bible that is about that. You know the we don't have the literature. We leave out. It's not that we leave out the question. We know that there are certain unanswerable questions for us, and we have to rely on a certain amount of faith. I think probably a much more reasonable question than where is God was, look at human beings, and that the Holocaust itself is not simply theologically about what you could call the absence or the eclipse of God. The Holocaust is about the descent to evil that human beings are capable of, and I think that those are important philosophical uh, avenues. Okay. All right. Any other points here? So we have the set of questions that are emerge from this text. This is like the preamble, the overture. Okay. Now we go. So I have my list of all the different characters, and I'm gonna I have I you know printed or whatever prepared this in light of just looking at what's going on here, and because we're in a visual medium, trying to place the text in front of you, and arbitrarily, I color coded the different characters in the text. Um, and I suppose, if I did the rigorous, statistical analysis, I would be able to find, a certain, maybe a pattern here. But I'll just let you think about this and go like, all right, so if God is in the highlighted in yellow, uh, how often is God in this text? And you can see that the text is a lot of God. How often is Pharaoh mentioned in the text? Well, Pharaoh is one, two, three, four, five times. And then there's Moses and Aaron. Moses is my green. One, two, three, four, and five, six, seven, eight, nine. Yeah. So you get the point. The point is that there are the here are the different interactions that are going on in in this kind of text, and these are the things that are the text is cueing us. Okay, it's saying as you read the stories of the plagues, here's what you need to think about. You need to think about God. Either Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh's heart. I put that together here, and even though it's God hardens Pharaoh's heart, it's Pharaoh's heart is part of Pharaoh, so Pharaoh's heart. You have the children of Israel, you have the land of Egypt and the people of Egypt, which are both subsumed under the term Mitzrayim, right? So Mitzrayim, it's Eretz Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim, but it's also Hamitzrim, and I think that's partly a language issue, and it's also, you know, it's a way of economizing the 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 text, but it's also a way of saying that the Egyptians and Egypt, it's kind of the same thing. We don't have individuals in Egypt. We have Pharaoh and the Egyptians, uh, and we have the children of Israel. We don't have the land of Israel. And the reason why we don't have the land of Israel is because we're not there. So the land of Israel is outside. It's imagined. It's outside of the scope of the story. But at least God has told Moses that he will take the people to the land. So the land is a fiction. It's a imaginative place. But it's obvious here that God is the one that's interacting with everything, um, and that part of the narrative and the experience of the narrative is to understand that each and every one of these elements is interacting in an interlocking web, or a set of a set of connections, so that there's the dynamic between God and Pharaoh. There's a dynamic between God and Moses, God and Aaron, Moses and Aaron, and God and Israel, God and Egypt, Israel and Egypt, etc. I didn't have the time to kind of make that into the diagram, but you kind of know, if you were to kind of make this into a septagon, you could show by having seven-sided polygon that each vertex of the polygon could interact with all the other ones around it, and then that's the narrative. Is there something significant to the number seven here? I'd like to think so, but I probably missed one or two elements, or not, and I'm always inclined to find seven, seven as a kind of unique wholeness to it. It may in fact be not accidental that the narrative consists of seven discrete elements. But I'll take that right now as my coincidence, and not something that I think is intended, although it makes for a nice little Devar Torah. Okay. Um, the there is the relationship between God and Bnei Israel, uh, and there is the relationship between Bnei Israel and the Egyptians, and all of that. So again, I guess I could say I'm starting the experience of this with a different set of objectives than the way I tell it on Passover. The way I tell it on Passover is to reenact, but I'm not even going to say it's reenactment. It's recitation, as it's liturgy. Okay, it's experiencing this as liturgy, and that's exactly what the Haggadah wants us to do, or I would say it's exactly how we, over the course of centuries, have col collapsed that text. We've made it into a prayer so that we get to that point in the Seder and go Dam Tzvardeya Kini Marov Der, etc. And that's a religious liturgical response or encapsulation of the story. But in the story, we're meant to ask, a different set of questions, which is, what does God want? How does Moses feel? I'll give you just a question that comes up right at the beginning here, which I'm sure many of you may be attuned to, which is, here I make of you Re'en etaticha Elohim lefaro v'aron achicha yeh neviecha. Okay? If you recall the story is that Moses, time and time again, about three times, at least in the opening chapters of Exodus, says, "What did you ask me for? I can't talk. I don't know how to talk. I have a stutter. I'm this. I'm kvad peh. I don't have I don't have the ability with language," which is very ironic because, as we point out often, once we get to the book of Dvarim, he just doesn't stop talking. Okay, Moses spends, talks and talks and talks for an entire book at the end of his life. So here is a person who says at the beginning of his career as a leader, "Lo ish dvarim anochi," I'm not a person of words, and then by the fifth book of the Torah is Ela dvarim. These are the words. So then you ask yourself, I I make you a god for Pharaoh means I'm giving you authority before him, and Aaron is going to be your prophet. And that itself tells you that we are in a kind of we've made a revolution in terms of the biblical imagination, because up until I think this point, everywhere we've had a brother, we've had conflict. Um, I'm still recalling, Genesis. We love the book, and no matter how often we read it, we are always going to encounter the theme of the siblings that are never quite, reconciled to each other. There's always conflict. The brothers in Egypt, have tremendous conflict with Joseph. They do reconcile, okay, but the reconciliation, I'll stop sharing for a second. The reconciliation of the brothers in Egypt affirms a hierarchy and not a partnership. I don't think you could ever find in the last chapters of Genesis the notion that Joseph and the brothers are partners. Quite the opposite. What you find at the end of Genesis is that we know who's in charge. Joseph's in charge. Now, we know who's in charge here, for Moses, but Moses can't function without Aaron. That makes Aaron indispensable. And that's partnership. And that's a new form of relationship. Okay. So even in this little text here, we are, by asking the question of who are all the characters and how do they interact with each other, what you see is, that there's a relationship of necessity, indispensability, partnership, symbiosis with Aaron. It's not a co-presidency because Moses is the president, Moses is the leader, but there is something indispensable with Aaron, and this evolves in ways that we are familiar with, because um, Moses will be the prophet and Aaron will be the priest, and they will have two departments, as it were, that are necessary for each other. Without Aaron, there's no Moses, and without Moses, there's no Aaron. Moses is peoplehood, and Aaron is, God, and there's the necessity of that. And so, you know, you could say then that when when they are brought before Pharaoh, Elohim, netaticha Elohim leFaro v'Aaron achicha yeneviecha, it's that. So I'm decoding it for an Israelite Judahite reader and saying, I get it. Okay. So it's not that there are two gods coming before Pharaoh. On the contrary, it's two elements that are part of the peoplehood that are coming before God. There's only one, they're coming before Pharaoh. There's only one God, and that one God is trying to make known to Pharaoh that that God is God, okay? But here is, the whole executive branch, and here is the whole ecclesiastical branch coming before Pharaoh. There's no judicial branch because Moses is the executive and judicial branch, as it were. But the ecclesiastical, there's only one ecclesiastical branch, only one priestly branch, and that represents the people now. It's so what we have here is a rather interesting kind of presentation. We're at a moment in we're at a historical day. Okay, so this kind of vocabulary is really common to us when you are thinking about what represents the people of the United States. You're thinking of the president and the Congress and the Senate and the judiciary and all of that, and they're all assembled, on the Capitol. It's why does the president take an oath from the Chief Justice, right? And what's the symbolism behind that? Well, it's obvious, right? I guess it's obvious, which is these are co-equal branches of government. This is the representation of the people, and yet there is a moment where the president, as the chief executive, is subordinate to the chief justice. And the message of that, I guess, is we are saying that the president is subject to the law, that the law takes precedence over everyone. That's the symbolic meaning of that, but that everybody is present at that moment. And so what you have, you don't have elected government in ancient Israel, but you have the leaders, and you have God, Moses, and Aaron. And what's happening is that Moses and Aaron are representing God, one God. Moses can't speak. Aaron is going to speak on behalf of Moses, and Moses is going to present, on himself as as a kind of as God's ambassador, simply because God, is not a body, and God needs an ambassador, and so and they are simultaneously ambassadors of God and ambassadors of people. That's kind of the beauty of it, that as Moses and Aaron present themselves before God, before Pharaoh, they are representing both God and the people before Pharaoh. Okay? How are we doing? Good. All right. Well, let's see how it plays itself out. So we go to the plague of blood, which is the first plague. God said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is heavy with stubbornness. He refuses to send the people free. Lecha paro b'boker, go to Pharaoh in the morning. Here he goes out of the Nile. Station yourself to meet him on the shore of the Nile, and the staff that changed into a snake take into your hand. And say to him, Adonai, God, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to you, shlachani alecha, lemor. Shalach et ami v'avduni, send my people free, so that they may serve me in the wilderness. V'hinei, here, lo shamata ad ko, you have not hearkened to me thus far. Ko amar Adonai, thus says God, Bezot teda, by this you shall know that I am God. Hinei, here, I will strike with the staff that is in my hand upon the water that is in the Nile, and it will change to blood. The fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will rot, and the Egyptians will be unable to drink water from the Nile. God said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their tributaries, over their Nile canals, over their ponds, and over all the bodies of water, and let them become blood. There will be blood throughout the land of Egypt, in the wooden containers and in the stoneware. And Moses and Aaron did this as God commanded them. He raised the staff, struck the water in the Nile before the eyes of Pharaoh, before the eyes of his servants. And all the water that was in the Nile changed into blood. The fish that were in the Nile died. The Nile reeked, and the Egyptians could not drink from the Nile. The blood was throughout all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did thus with their occult, uh, their occult arts, and Pharaoh's heart remained strong-willed, and he did not hearken to them as God had spoken. So Pharaoh faced about and came into his house, neither did he pay any mind to this. But all Egypt had to dig around the Nile to drink water, for they could not drink from the waters of the Nile. 7 days were fulfilled after God had struck the Nile. So, you read, I'm going to just say this one more time, which is at the Seder, all you say is Dam, but here is a story. And the story has all of these elements to it, including God, Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh, the people of Israel, the people of Egypt, the Egyptians, etc., etc. And you have additional elements here, the magicians of Egypt. And and I know we've studied this in the past. I can't help but but pull out at least one element of the story here, which is okay. So if we're going to see this as a human story and a story of a leader and a story of a people and a story of a leader who supposedly cares about his people, and and it's a story about God and a story about Egypt, and a story about the Nile, and it's a story that has this imagery of water and blood, and a story that whose listeners rooted in the land of Israel who have a certain association with water and a certain association with Egypt and its irrigation, they get it, right? So what's the backstory? The backstory is that Egypt is all about the Nile. The Nile irrigates everything. The Nile, you go to the Nile, you bring water from the Nile, you dig trenches from the Nile that will irrigate your fields, and and that's how you live. You live off of the Nile, right? Whereas in the land of Israel, you live off of the sky. You live off of the rain. This is, pointed out in the book of Deuteronomy very, very, carefully and succinctly and clearly, right? The land of Israel is not like the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt, you just stick your foot in and you get water. The land of Israel depends on the heavens. So you have here Pharaoh. I love the line here, which is the whole country is been plagued. The people can't sustain themselves, and Pharaoh just turns away and goes into his house, and he didn't pay attention. But all the Egypt had to dig around the Nile for drink water, for they could not drink from the waters of the Nile. That's fascinating, and of course, it raises a whole set of just a second. It raises a whole set of questions. You know, you know, what's being told here? And is it a story? How do the people subsist for a few days, 7 days without water? And what does it mean? Does the Nile regenerate itself? And all that. And is Pharaoh just saying, what's the point? It's the the Nile. We all know that the Nile flows and the water goes to the sea, and so. If the Nile's been inundated with blood, it's just going to empty out, and that's what happens with water, right? It's just a way of looking at it. And and here, it's it's a story that has all of these layers to it. Go ahead, Annette. You're mute. I need to hear you. Mute.
Okay. So, hey, Rabbi. So I don't even want to ask why the blood was the first plague. It seems too simple, pertaining to what you're talking about. What I want to ask you is there, like, I don't know anything about Egyptian society. Like, what is the connection with the blood in terms of Egyptian society and, God making the Nile red blood?
Well, the connection is the Nile, not blood. That's the Nile. The Nile is, the life force in Egypt. You could look at this in a number of ways, and you could say, okay, so here is the Nile, that pumps itself through. Without the Nile, Egypt is a wasteland. Egypt is an arid, piece of land. It will die. So in a way, there is a kind of subtext here, which is when a Hebrew, Bible literate person hears about blood, blood is life, okay? And there's it's not a joke that's being made here, but it's a kind of poke in the eye, which is blood is life, life belongs to God, and we know that you are sustained by the Nile, but we're going to bring you the Jewish symbol here, and you're going to choke off of that. So you're going to choke off of a God who's all life, right? There seems to be a kind of collision of all these symbols here, and I think that's overt. That's intended. Okay, go, Ruth.
So I kind of don't understand Paro's bullheadedness. Moshe and Aaron changed the Nile into blood. And then Paro says, that's okay, I have my Khartoumim here, except they're not able to undo what he did. So he just says he turns around and goes home. And for 7 days, it's blood. So he's bragging about his Khartoumim, but or he wasn't bragging about them. He just thought to himself, I've got these, people who can break the curse, but they couldn't. And yet he didn't
It,
get
it,
it.
it does say, I'm just going to just quote the verse 22 here says that the magicians of Egypt did this with their gods. So they did do it. They tried to replicate the plague, and they were capable of replicating the plague. This is why Pharaoh was not terribly moved by this. There is a moment in the plague narrative, which you might recall, where the Egyptians are not capable of replicating it, right? But it's like, Pharaoh says, well, I can see my magicians do that too. What's the point? I'm not going to pay attention to this, right? And so what we get here is a bit of a character sketch. We're getting, here is you have God and you have Pharaoh. God is concerned about all creatures, right? And Pharaoh's ultimately will be concerned only about himself, you know, and that's why I find that little verse where Pharaoh turns and goes home to be, I'm offended. I'm offended by that, right? Because what it says is that when there's a national catastrophe, you know, the leader of the nation, I need the leader of the nation to pay attention to me. I mean, I don't want, I'm saying it with humor, but I'm saying it also with pathos because that's what you want. That's what you want. You people want to be, uh, fed or nourished not only by their to be sustained by their physical needs, but they want to know that someone cares about them. And the fact that right off the bat it demonstrates to us that Pharaoh really doesn't care about the people. I mean, it's gobsmacking. It's astonishing. It's an astonishing detail that at the beginning of the story tells you everything you need to know. Pharaoh doesn't care, and God cares. Okay. Any other? Go ahead, Alana.
Uh, Maybe it's not what most people think, but why did the children of Israel had to be slaves for 400 years and then to go through such a complicated procedure to be free again? Um, what's the point?
Would it be better if they've just a dozen years? so I know that the question, I mean, is it's a bothersome question, right? And and is it 200? Is it 400? It's a long time. It's a long time. Um, and there are many themes that are pulled out of that. One of which is, how many generations is that? And where does memory where do you lose memory and where do you lose connection? We could make the argument that it's that a lifespan and memory, living memory, is about 4 generations in duration. Okay, most of us don't have knowledge of our great grandparents, but I suspect, and that's because, our great parent, in my own case, our great grandparents, were, either killed, or came from a world that was destroyed. And so we have a big, abyss when it comes to, thinking beyond our great grandparents. I mean, part of the envy that many of us have to, let's say, other people is that we can't go to ancestral graves fairly easily. It's very, very difficult. I think, one of the unique things that I'm looking. I have a grandchild, and we all have grandchildren, I guess, and it's like, part of what will make their world interesting is that they actually have more access to their past than any other, age in history. They'll be able to pull out, records with tremendous ease. Okay, to what extent that will populate their narrative is a different story. But it's quite likely that in their lifetime they will have the computational power to summon up uh, you know, not 4 generations, but maybe, a dozen generations. It's already happened. There are people who have done genealogical things. We have people in the shul that have genealogy down, back to the mid 1800s or 1700. I mean, that's phenomenal. Okay. So, what does it mean to have 200 years? It means the limit of human memory and the limit of telling. That's how I understand it. Is that I mean, it's an interpretation, okay? And the other, why does it have to be that way? It's a simple answer to a very complicated question, and I'll say it as follows: God wants to be known as the God who took Israel out of Egypt. The first commandment, I think, is the answer to your question, Alana. Anochi Adonai Elohechem, asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God, who took you out of Egypt.
But but he put them there. He put them there.
But that's it. He's a redeeming God. And that it's interesting, that God how identifies himself as a redeeming God and not as the creating God. I am the Lord your God who created the universe, and you're important to me, so I want to make my covenant with you. No, I am the Lord your God who took you out of slavery and made you free. That means that it's more important for you to know that I redeem slaves than it is for you to know that I created the world. I want you to know that human freedom is more important. Is a more important beginning to the religious covenantal understanding. Okay, and in order to do that, I mean, here you're not going to be satisfied with this because it's not a satisfactory answer. But it's in order to do, you have to experience slavery. In order to do that, you have to know what it means to not be free. So you have to be subjected to that, and that's it's a kind of like circular answer. It's almost like saying, I hate to say it, because, but it's not because. It's the world, that the story that we tell ourselves is that we are connected to a redeeming God. If we were a different religion, we would be telling ourselves a different story, which would be the story we are telling ourselves is that we are connected to a creative God, right? We're just a creature. or the story that we're telling is that we are connected to the Almighty God, or the story that we're telling us is the story that God is a forgiving God. That's Christianity. God that God will only we God are is also forgiving, but the dominant story is that God redeems us from slavery. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, time's not going to permit addressing
Okay,
what I was going to say, but let me just offer three additional questions to the ones you listed
we'll leave.
that to me were important this year. Question one is, at this point in time, did the children of Israel realize that they were enslaved?
Nice. Okay.
Question number two is, what role did the plagues play in helping the Jewish people understand that they were enslaved and transform their own character as a people, much like for each of the patriarchs and others, that they were transformational in some way? What's the spiritual message? And the third, which was the most intriguing quasi Hasidic question, is how does this relate to the title of this book, Shemot? And one of the things is that there were all kinds of names being mentioned, and it were the names as well as the people that went into captivity in Egypt. And so each of these names of plagues represents challenges that can help people to spiritually grow. And so there's a lot of interesting discussion about this, but I know one of the things I like to do during the Seder is ask the question, why is it that we eat matzah before maror? Since historically the slavery presumably preceded the freedom. And there was a rabbi in the 1800s said we have to taste freedom in order to know what slavery is. Very
Interesting.
provocative.
Yeah. So were they aware of their servitude? And the answer is they were aware of their suffering. Did they have the kind of the philosophical apparatus of yeah, slavery was a feature of antiquity, and at a certain point they knew what they could and couldn't do. They knew where a person knows when they're free or when they're not free. You know, one of the big conversations that we have around this is to what extent were the people able to shake off their servitude, in the sense of that's a question that guides us. You know, did they experience the plagues in the way that you described, you know, uh, or understand them? And here, we're watching something in real time. When the war in Lebanon started, there was no we watched the beeper explosions, and then things just accelerated. And at no time did they say we're in war. We officially started a war in Lebanon. They never said that. It was just like the beepers exploded. The next day, the walkie-talkies exploded. The next day, they destroyed the headquarters, and on and on and on and on. And they just went in, and at some point, you say, I guess we're in a war now. I guess it's different. And I think about that in terms of, are you aware of what's going on? And I think, when things are happening in real time, you may not be aware that it's part of it's because it's so chaotic. Again, we're experiencing, one element of this war. I got up in shul last Shabbos and I said, if this agreement, comes to fruition, it may signal the beginning of the end. This is, and I approach it with a kind of emotion. I was very emotional talking about it and saying, I think I'm aware that this moment is a moment that says we are now in a different phase. It's hard not to sense it, but then again, we're limited by a certain we don't know. We know nothing. We know nothing of next week, of the following week, etc. And we don't know if this is going to hold. We have lots and lots of questions about everything. We really don't know where we are. But this is locating ourselves within a certain thing. There were people, if you read Bret Stephens in the New York Times, he said this, a while ago when the Ukraine war started, and he said we may look back at this period as a world war, because you have all sorts of elements, areas in the world that are at war with each other, and they're all interconnected. For example, the Ukraine war is very much connected to the Middle East because Iran supplies weapons to Ukraine, to Russia. There's an alliance, a Russia-Iranian alliance. So, put it all together and you have, you know, maybe 20 years from now, historians will say, yeah, there's a convergence of all these things. So in real time, what is an Israelite experiencing? A good question.
So, Rabbi, respectfully, I have no doubt they were suffering and they were in servitude.
Yes, of
But if
course.
that's all they were born into, they're not going to know that they were enslaved. And
Ah,
just coming out, so
okay.
that's part of where I'm going to is sort of the
Sure.
plagues
Well,
raising awareness.
so then do you want to superimpose on that the African American experience of slavery and say the children born into slavery? I mean, they knew that they weren't free. They may have been depends on how you tell the story and how you narrate it. But who wouldn't want their freedom? That's the point. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you all. Have a good week, and see you soon. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
תודה.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you so much.